A boy disrupted his father's wedding by revealing a terrible secret about his father's fiancée. He stood in the corner of the room, palms pressed against the glass, watching everyone get ready. Everything had to be perfect on this day, like it always was, like everyone else's. But Martin lacked the confidence that everything here was as it should be. The tables are decorated with white ribbons, there are pictures on the walls, laughing faces and open arms, and the music plays light chords, evoking old holidays. It's like the best movies, where there are no blemishes, no shadows. It seemed so, but he could feel it, something was wrong. Somewhere in the far corner of the room she stood, Alice. The bride. He had never seen her so close, so perfect. Just like in those movies, only not in the brightest scenes. She was smiling, but that smile wasn't really hers. It was like she was squinting, keeping a little distance from everyone, and then, it was as if her gaze lingered a little on her father. The attention to him was strange. Not as usual, not as he remembered. Too caring, too insistent. Martin watched her every move, caught every detail, noticing how she, standing next to his father, walked by and touched his shoulder casually. It was so quick that everyone but him probably didn't even notice. At that moment Martin froze, but continued to watch her hand disappear into the sleeve of her white dress. The girl's gaze slid back to his father. It seemed as if she were checking to see if everything was all right. Something about her manner around him was foreign, unnatural. She reached over, touched his hand, took it gently, but there was something wrong. It was too easy. Without the usual confidence. Martin saw her fingers barely touch his skin, and her gaze slid involuntarily to his father. She stood close, but her whole body said she was out of place. He couldn't understand it, but he knew for sure, this wasn't how it was supposed to be. It wasn't what he was supposed to see, and it wasn't what he expected. Everything around him, as if taken from a photo album, perfect and flawless. But not for him. Martin noticed her smile again. It was too strained. She was too good. Too right. As if she were just a photograph, pieced together from fragments from different lives. Too artificial, as if her face was frozen into a mask. His gaze followed her until she turned, and with such ease she disappeared into the crowd, growing farther and farther away from him. But the farther away she went, the more vivid the very small details he noticed became. The way she fixed her hair, the way she avoided looking at other people, her little gestures that became more and more alien each time. But the strangest thing, the most disturbing thing, was that there was nothing random about her movements. She knew what she was doing, and she knew how to do it. While everyone was busy preparing for the wedding, he felt like he was watching something much more important. Something that wasn't as simple as a celebration as fun. Something that wasn't supposed to be here. He tried to keep all these thoughts inside him, not letting them out, but with every step he took, his anxiety grew. He remembered his father laughing a couple months ago when he'd said he'd found his perfect soulmate. He remembered how she had accepted him into her life with such ease. How she was so perfect, so flawless to everyone. But something about it was too much. Something that perhaps he alone could feel. And something that could have been scary. He saw her again. It was the same evening, the same light, warm and soft, as if everything in this house had been designed to look flawless. The bride, the same Alice, stood in the center of the room like a perfect piece of art. But every glance at Martin made him question this picture. Everything around her was too smooth, too right. When she entered, all eyes were fixed on her, as a bride should be. The longer Martin watched her, however, the more he began to doubt her sincerity. The same subtle but noticeable fake accent in her voice. The slight tremor in her hands as she took the wine glass, as carefully as if she was afraid of disturbing the perfect picture. She was there, but not quite there. It was as if she was watching the scene from the side, feeling that she didn't belong among all these people. Martin caught himself thinking that perhaps she hadn't even noticed his gaze, but he knew she was watching. It was in her manner, in the way she scrutinized everyone, the way she laughed with those she didn't seem interested in. He noticed how she held back a smile when one of the guests brought up something unexpected. She didn't look surprised, didn't seem genuinely interested. Everything had been thought out in advance. She knew how to react. He watched her go around everyone, carefully keeping the conversation going, but always with a barely perceptible distance. She knew how to be gracious, how to make the right accents, but there was no warmth in her eyes that could explain her place here. Martin had seen her look away slightly when someone came too close. And every time her eyes met with one of the guests, there was something in her gaze. Not friendliness, not sincerity. It was like a mask she could put on and take off at any moment. She always stayed on her best behavior, always looked confident, but if you looked closely, her mannerisms resembled something theatrical. Her movements were precise and practiced, every gesture as if it were a scholar's learned by heart. Martin could not understand exactly what seemed wrong in her behavior. It was as if every word she said, every reaction was part of a prearranged script. Her eyes lacked the lively sincerity that a person should have at such an important moment. When they happened to cross paths in the hallway, he caught the tension in her posture. She became a little more tense when she noticed his gaze, but immediately returned her mask, that same perfect, carefully rehearsed smile. He could see her hands trembling slightly as she fixed her hair, but her face didn't give away the slightest bit of excitement. Everything was under control. Her behavior became more and more strange with each new look. When one of the guests talked to her about something unremarkable, she always seemed a little distant, as if her thoughts were somewhere far away, somewhere else. She did not listen, but only answered. Martin felt it, like a strange emptiness behind her words. A slight smile, but no real interest, no real attachment to what was going on. He could see her gaze lingering on his father at times, her movements becoming a little more tense as he approached. It wasn't so much the art of manipulation as something else. Martin didn't know exactly what it was, but in that moment he felt some unspeakable tension hang in the air. She was trying to be perfect for his father, but it was all too played out, too polished. He couldn't understand exactly what drove her, what was behind it, but he sensed that something darker lurked behind her appearance. Her attention to him was almost absent. She paid no attention to him. Perhaps because she wasn't interested in children, or maybe because she didn't know how to pretend for them. Everything she showed to others, this warm, caring devoid of sincerity, did not concern him. The moment their gazes met again, he realized that something in her eyes was unfinished. She couldn't hide it, and Martin felt that that was the real truth about her. With every move she made, with every gesture, she became more and more alien. But not to everyone. It was in that moment that he felt it. Alice wasn't just playing a role. She was part of the game, but her face was hidden behind a mask, and that mask could not be removed. Martin didn't know what alarmed him most, her attempts to hide something or the moments when she managed to hide it from everyone else. He began to notice more than he had before, details that others might not have noticed. But to him, it was like a game in which the stakes were too high to ignore. Alice increasingly became the center of his thoughts, and with each new glance he became more and more convinced that something in her past was hidden from everyone. She could be beautiful, elegant, perfect, but somehow she never once seemed real. It was as if she herself couldn't believe she was playing her part. Martin noticed this in her speech. He remembered how once, in a conversation with guests, she had immediately changed the subject abruptly as soon as someone mentioned her hometown. Martin hadn't paid much attention to it at the time, but now, looking back, he realized that Alice looked tense. She was smiling diligently, but her eyes, as always, gave her away. They shifted a little to the side, and at that moment her voice became cold and a little mechanical. Martin understood that she was afraid that someone would find out about something that would ruin this image of the perfect bride. She often avoided certain topics. When someone started talking about her family or children, she always smiled, but then answered with one short sentence. When asked about her past, she answered with obvious discomfort, as if she knew her past didn't fit the image. Those evasive phrases, it's been a long time since I've seen them, well, it's too personal, seemed unnatural, as if she was trying to convince everyone that her life had been empty before she met his father. Martin sensed that she wasn't just avoiding certain topics. She was holding back something much more. He couldn't figure out what exactly was behind that flawless mask, but the fact that she wasn't who she claimed to be was becoming more and more obvious. One day, while walking around the house, Martin happened to see her standing by the window, alone with herself. She did not notice him, and he froze in place, watching. Alice stood leaning on the window sill, looking somewhere in the distance, but her eyes were empty. It was as if she were trying to find something in the misty air outside the window. There was no concern or joy in her gaze, just a kind of coldness, incomprehensible, alien. She seemed so alien in this moment, as if this image she had entered was too small for her. Martin sighed and stepped back, but his step gave away his presence. Alice turned quickly, and in a second was back to her usual pose. A smile, a look full of confidence, and her usual grace. But it was too much for Martin. He saw her real reaction, the one that was hidden beneath the layer of her perfect mask. With each new day, he could feel her mystery becoming more distinct. She never answered questions in a straightforward manner. When someone asked her a question about her friends or work, She usually answered with a bit of sarcasm or went into general phrases. But what surprised him the most was her behavior when it came to talking about her past. She was ready to talk about the future, about her father, about the wedding, but once her childhood was touched upon, it was as if she froze. Her lips tightened and her eyes looked away. Or there was another moment. At dinner one night, one of the guests asked, seemingly innocently, "Have you always been so confident?" With a smile, deliberately pushing the conversation. But Alice only briefly replied, "Yeah, well, I'm just used to being like that." And after that phrase, her gaze became so cold that everyone at the table didn't notice the change. He saw her face go pale for a moment, and then she turned her mask back on. Every time she said something about herself, about how things had worked out, her words seemed too smooth, too perfectly calibrated. Everything was nice and neat, but there was no pain, no fear, no doubt, those things that are always present in a real person's life. And that was what seemed suspicious. Martin began to think that perhaps Alice was afraid of something, not only of exposure, but of herself. He didn't know exactly what that fear was, but he was sure that something much darker lurked behind her perfect exterior. And he felt more and more that if he could uncover just one detail of her past, he might realize what she was really hiding. But every time he got closer to figuring it out, she became more and more adept at closing all the windows to cover her tracks. Everything around her seemed contrived, and this falseness became not just strange to him, but frightening. Every day Martin became more and more convinced that Alice was not who she said she was, and everything he had seen before was just a veil hiding a much deeper and darker truth. But what was behind that mask? Martin didn't know how to begin. He couldn't find the words to accurately describe what he was feeling. He just knew that something was wrong. Every day when he saw them together, when he looked at his father and Alice, something inside him froze. He couldn't understand how everyone could be so blind. But the worst part was that his father didn't seem to notice anything that was happening right in front of his eyes. He was in love. Or maybe he just didn't want to see. Martin couldn't hold it in any longer. He had to tell his father, had to make him realize that Alice wasn't who she said she was. Every time Martin tried to talk, his father just wouldn't listen to him. He looked at him like he was some kid who didn't understand what was going on. "You're just worrying too much, Martin, it's normal," he would say, and that was it. His words seemed to carry no weight. Every time they discussed Alice, my father would reply, "She's a nice girl, and you'll realize that when you're older." These words, like a knife to the heart, stumped Martin every time. How could one be so blind? How could one not see what was obvious? He tried to find other ways to get his point across, but as soon as he started to speak, his father immediately blocked his attempts. "Martin, you're an adult, you should understand how it is. You don't have to complicate things," he said, and there wasn't an ounce of doubt in his voice. There was only one thing in his eyes: conviction. A conviction that his son couldn't possibly understand what was really going on in his life. It was as if he, a grown man, knew better. With each passing day, Martin felt the estrangement between him and his father growing. His suspicions were growing stronger, and his feelings were increasingly unrequited. He saw his father and Alice growing closer together, as if they were the only world, and he was an extra, like some superfluous element in this perfect picture. But his presence wasn't necessary. His father couldn't or wouldn't notice it. When Martin went up to his father one evening to try to talk again, he saw him sitting in his chair, immersed in his thoughts, and so childishly happy. He was as sure of his rightness as a child who had just been given a toy. And at that moment Martin realized that all his efforts had been in vain. He stood in front of his father, and no words came. He wanted to scream, to tear the truth out of himself, but he couldn't. He knew it was all pointless. "Dad," he said quietly, "you don't see what she's hiding. You don't see that there's something wrong with her? Don't you see that she's not who she says she is?" The father put the book aside and looked at his son as if he were something strange. He sighed, and that sigh was full of regret. "Martin, you don't understand. You're too young to talk like this. It's just your fantasy, nothing more. You have to learn to trust people, including me." "I know what I'm doing," he replied, his voice sounding tired, as if he didn't care. Martin felt as if his words were missing the point. He spoke, and his father, instead of hearing, brushed it off as something not worthy of attention. He was an adult, he knew how things worked, and Martin was only a child incapable of understanding what was really going on. And that was the worst of it. With each new conversation, with each new look, Martin felt their distance growing. He didn't know how to win his father back, how to bring out what should have been obvious in him. But instead, he saw his father becoming more and more caught up in Allison's reality, and Martin becoming just a voice in the background to him, not worthy of attention. He couldn't understand how his father could be so naive. But maybe naivete was what made him ignore all these oddities. He didn't want to see, he didn't want to hear. It was easier for him to believe in this image of the perfect girl than to face the dark spots that were beginning to appear around this perfect picture. Either way, Martin felt his loneliness growing. He saw his father turn a blind eye to what was happening. And he, Martin, remained the only one who saw what was behind it all. And it was excruciating. Martin hesitated for a long time. He knew that this moment would come sooner or later, but he didn't think it would be so difficult. Each minute dragged on, as if the longer he kept silent, the easier it became. But eventually he realized, if he didn't say it now, he would never be able to again. He couldn't watch his father lose his blind confidence in Alice over and over again. He couldn't watch them both move into this pit, this labyrinth of lies where the truth was hidden behind rainbow promises. It was as if the wedding was meant to be perfect. The whole day was arranged to seem flawless, with smiles, with fun, with music, with those very moments when the whole world around seems to come to a standstill. Martin didn't even know what wouldn't let him go. He watched everyone at this celebration as if they were living by the rules, and he was the only one who knew that behind those rules lay something completely different. At the moment when the whole family gathered around the table, when the cake began to be served, when his father and Alice looked at each other with that look of what should have been serenity, Martin couldn't stand it. He knew that this was his last chance. He took the glass and stepped forward. All heads turned toward him, and his heart raced. "Dad, there's something I have to tell you." His voice was cold, hard, but with a slight tremor. He couldn't say it without knowing what would happen next. But there was no other way. His father looked up, and Alice tensed. Some alarm flashed in her gaze, but she quickly hid it, adopting the familiar masquerade of a smiling girl. He couldn't stay silent any longer, and everything he had built up over the weeks came rushing out. You don't know who she is," Martin said, his eyes piercing his father. "Alice is hiding her past life from you. Everything you see is a performance she's put on for you. She's not who she says she is." Martin felt the tension that hung in the air become palpable. The whole hall froze. His father froze for a moment, and then grinned as if he hadn't taken his son's words seriously. "Martin, are you crazy? We all know she's a wonderful girl." His voice sounded even, but his eyes, which avoided his son's gaze, gave away his anxiety. But Martin didn't stop. He knew that if he didn't say everything now, his father would never understand. He jumped up and spoke faster, as if in a hurry to say everything before he was stopped. "You don't understand. She's hiding the fact that she's been married, and more than once. You don't know that she left her previous husbands under the most bizarre circumstances. You don't know that she's done, things, and more than once." His voice became more insistent, but in his heart he felt that something was wrong, that his words were not as certain as he had hoped. He continued on despite this, feeling more and more strongly that something wasn't adding up for him. His father had already risen from his seat, his face red with indignation. All the guests began to whisper, and Alice stood nearby, seemingly too calm for what was happening. "Are you out of your mind, Martin?" His father's voice became harsh, almost desperate. He didn't want to hear it, didn't want to believe it. But something in Martin's voice made him stop and listen, if only for a moment. He noticed that the boy was not joking, and that he had indeed recognized something. His father's gaze was now full of doubt. "I have found proof," Martin continued without even looking at Alice. He couldn't look at her, couldn't meet her gaze, because he probably already knew the answer. "I found records, photographs, even documents that confirm that her past is not clean at all. You have no idea what she's hiding from you." A scandal was brewing, and even when his father raised his hand to stop it, Martin couldn't shut up. All he could think about in his head was that his father might still not realize the whole truth. And then, at the very moment of the breakup, something unusual happened. Alice, standing beside them, spoke softly. "You're wrong, Martin. Everything you say is a lie." Her voice was steady, calm, and without the slightest excitement. But something in her words made Martin freeze. He couldn't believe it. This wasn't the usual reaction to an attack. It was a quiet, confident response, as if she had been waiting for that question. And in her eyes, there was no fear. She looked at him as if she already knew everything beforehand. It was frightening. Her father's frantic glance in her direction didn't betray any alarm. He was too absorbed in his anger at his son. But at that moment, when all eyes returned to Alice, Martin was overcome with anxiety. He didn't know what exactly was wrong, but it all seemed strange to him. And if she was the culprit, something still didn't add up. The truth he was trying to unearth wasn't proving to be that simple. A question resounded in his mind. What if it was all true? And what if there was something else he didn't understand? That moment was like a cliffhanger. The shocking truth, revealed at the most inappropriate moment, remained a mystery that hung in the air. His father continued to argue with him, but something in his eyes said that the questions were not finished. Martin sat in the corner of the empty room, where there was usually music, laughter, and conversation. But now everything was silent. The whole wedding, this whole day, was only an echo of the words he had spoken. He could feel thoughts like a fog slowly spreading through his head, giving him no peace. He didn't know what exactly he was trying to find. The truth? Or just an opportunity to prevent this moment from happening? He never thought his struggle would lead to what had happened. He looked at his father, who was there with Aliska, with her perfect smile, with her behavior that had long ago stopped seeming normal to him. He still didn't understand how it could have happened, how his father could have been so blind. But with every second he spent in that house, with every new glimpse of his happy, childishly enthusiastic father, Martin began to realize, perhaps he could no longer be the one to shatter that illusion. Perhaps he really should leave things the way they were. He looked at the table where the wedding used to be, where all the guests were having fun. All that remained was silence. Only the burning candles and the shadows that lay in the corners were left of all those emotions that had long since disappeared. He could no longer be the one to ruin those moments. And for a moment, despite all the truth, despite all his doubts, he felt everything inside him calm down a little. When he looked at his father sitting next to Alice, he realized that nothing would change. He had always known that you couldn't take away what made people happy, even if that happiness was built on illusions. His father was happy, and that was enough for him. Everything that he had once tried to understand, that he had unraveled, didn't matter now. Could he get his family back? Maybe it was the only way. In that moment, he felt a heaviness on his soul, as if the rift between him and his father had become final. He couldn't get rid of the thought that it wasn't just his decision, but their shared mistake. He didn't know if this move was the right one, but it was the only one. He was faced with a choice: seek the truth to the end, destroying everything he had, or leave these questions unanswered and go on with his life without interfering in other people's lives. And so, in that moment, he realized that looking for answers was probably not worth it. There were too many unanswered questions. He sighed and looked around the room. Every corner, every object now seemed so familiar, so foreign at the same time. He couldn't forget all those moments when he and his father had been closer, when it had been easier. But now, no matter what happened, no matter what he tried to understand, the answers never came. All that was left was an emptiness that wasn't filled with anything but those mute words that hung in the air. Alice came toward him again, her smile almost the same as it had always been. But he saw her differently now, saw her somehow more aloof. He realized that it wasn't just her face. It was a symbol that behind all that pretty picture was a terrible emptiness. "Everything will be all right," she said, her voice as calm as before. But Martin no longer believed in those words. He didn't know what would happen next, and he didn't know if he could believe in her. He took a step back, retreating into a corner. He was on his own, left with questions he could no longer ask. Perhaps it was a decision not to interfere, not to seek answers, not to destroy. To realize that in some cases, the answer, if there is one, will never be found. Martin looked at his father, and there was no anger in his eyes, no disappointment. He just knew that things would remain as they were. The truth that was hidden behind that perfect mask would remain hidden. And maybe that was better. When they sat down at the table, when the music began to play again, when people began to joke and laugh again, Martin felt his heart sink. He didn't know where the truth belonged now, where he belonged. But he knew one thing: he could no longer be the one to break this silence, these illusions. It wasn't his decision. It was his father's decision, and his place now was not to seek the truth, but to accept it all, even if it meant the answers would never be found. Martin sat looking at these people, his father and Alice, and realized that some questions would remain unanswered. And perhaps that was the biggest truth of all.